Today we have a reading that is also has connections to the gospel, put it that way. And it's the story of the Queen of Sheba coming to see all that Solomon has, especially his wisdom. Now, Sheba is Ethiopia. So she has come from Ethiopia to experience we could say Sheba today is called Ethiopia. And she is there visiting the King Solomon. Something we want to add in light of that. I remember many, many years ago, there was a professor for probably Black Studies, and he was talking about how there is great wisdom from Africa and always has been. I remember reading that going, or watching him, he was on TV going, yeah, we know that. But apparently many people didn't know. And one example of that would be the Queen of Sheba. She understood where wisdom was, and she came to see Solomon. But there's tremendous history. Well, granted, I'm not saying this because it's Black History Month, in the words of Samuel Jackson, who does not like Black History Month, and he says, when's White History Month? I mean, it's a good point in the fact that it's not about focusing on Black history. It's about kind of segregating the reality of the Black community, when instead we should turn around and say, but let's look at all the great wisdom that comes from the Black community all year round, as well as all the other communities. And a lot of people forget that. And so they go, well, the Queen of Sheba. And Jesus cites the Queen of Sheba in his gospel as well, and talking to the people and saying, look, the Queen of Sheba came to hear Solomon, and you have a greater Solomon here, and you're missing this whole story. So what's up with you? He obviously doesn't express it that way, but that's basically what comes out. And so, yes, because there is tremendous wisdom in every single culture. And for us not to believe that is not to believe theologically the truth that God created all people, and therefore there's tremendous wisdom there. So I was always fascinated by it. He says, yeah, but, he's like explaining, there's this tremendous wisdom from the Black community. Yeah, I've always known that. As a matter of fact, maybe in some cases, a lot more wisdom than you'd expect. Actually, there's something I saw. I was fascinated by this. Something I saw the other day. It was a link to a video, and it was not from Lionel. He was the one that did the link. If you know who Lionel is, he does overnights on WABC. In any case, but it talked about there was. It was a Popeye's chicken, and may have been in maybe the inner city someplace. And there was a man who came in who was smoking crack. And, of course, all the people in Popeye's were Black. So a man came in smoking crack. And apparently one of the other people who was there was pregnant. One of the women there was pregnant. And right away, this guy just come up and he ran him out. Get the heck out of here, you're smoking crack. There's a pregnant woman here. And I'm sitting there going, that would never occur to me. A secondhand crack smoke would be dangerous to pregnant women. And he literally stood up, and there's a pregnant woman there. What are you doing? And ran him out of Popeyes. And I'm listening to that going, wow, that's something that would never, ever occur to me. And yet in that whole thing of saving the culture, saving, the humanity, so to speak. I mean, I'm not literally saying saving humanity, but that genetic disposition to self-preservation, he stood up and went, no, this cannot be. I was fascinated by that. And because I've never been in a position where someone in the same room I'm in is smoking crack, or I've never been around anyone smoking crack in my life. I wouldn't know it from a hole in the wall. But I was fascinated by that. This something that would never occur to me in 1,000 years. And you can say the same thing with secondhand smoke and other. I mean, people will say that that's all BS, but there, he's saying there is a pregnant woman. You do not do that in the presence because it's going to hurt the woman and or the baby. Fascinating. So we're talking about that in light of the fact that the Queen of Sheba comes to hear the whole wisdom of Solomon. And as Jesus mentions, and she sees all his great stuff. She sees all his great material. But one of the things that happens is she comes to hear his wisdom. Because remember, she wanted to hear his wisdom. And in hearing his wisdom, she recognized the great power that was there, because what she's recognizing is the wisdom of God. Now, we haven't covered this because it wasn't part of the readings this year. May come up later on, is that Solomon asked God for wisdom. And that was one of the powerful things that happened. So Solomon asked God for wisdom, and he received great wisdom. And now the Queen of Sheba is coming to hear this great wisdom. And this is what's going on. But then she sees all the other things that's all part of this. And she's recognizing this powerfully. And this is something, and of course, it connects also with Jesus. And we also understand something that's an interesting note that comes from the New American Bible Revised Edition that points out that she comes to hear his wisdom. But it is the Queen of Sheba who points out to him that his role is judgment and justice. And as we look at this from Dewey Rams, it says, "Blessed be the Lord your God, whom you have pleased, and who has set upon you the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever and has appointed you king to do judgment and justice." So she is telling him this is his reason to be king, to do judgment and justice. And what is it that we are always looking forward to? We're looking forward to the kingdom of God. Why? Because it is the fulfillment of happiness, but what else? It is where there will be true justice. Remember, St. Paul says the kingdom of God is not about eating and drinking, it's about peace and justice. So we're looking for a just kingdom. This is what we are looking for, and this is what it's all about. Because, as the saying goes, if you want peace, work for justice, from Pope Paul VI. But we see that within context. She's coming to hear his great wisdom, and his great wisdom comes from understanding the deep things of God, of living the deep things of God, and also understanding God's truth and justice. Because remember, God is not true, rather. I just blew that, but we'll do that. God is not true. He is not just. He is the source of truth and justice. That's who God is. So she understands that, and she's coming to listen to this great wisdom. And again, there she is, the Queen of Sheba, coming from Africa. Now, one of my favorite stories when we want to talk about this true, intense wisdom that she came to hear, but also understanding where she's coming from, because there's great wisdom in all the people of God, but obviously in the African continent. And this is something that a lot of people may not fully comprehend, because there was so much colonization in the African continent. And what did the colonization do? It basically ended up forcing the modern Enlightenment philosophy on the ancient people, saying that they were uncivilized. But there is a great amount of wisdom in these ancient ideas, these ancient cultures. And one of my favorite examples of that is the source of bungee jumping, believe it or not. If you don't know the source of bungee jumping, which I suppose your greatest wisdom is going to tell you don't bungee jump, but that's a different story, is that there is a tribe in Africa. I don't know if it's still there, but this ancient tribe that lived by the ancient ways and everything else. And you all know that these different rites and rituals that they would do so that boys would become men. They would do these powerful, very intense rituals. Well, in this particular tribe, what they did was they would tie vines onto the boy's legs, and he would jump off a cliff, and he would come as close as he could without hitting his head on the ground. And of course, it was all about bravery and trust and everything else. Now, remember, this is an ancient tribe. This isn't something they learned at Harvard. This is an ancient tribe. So that's what they were doing. And the reason why this was developed is because teenage boys go through this development process. And in that process, they have an increase of testosterone, which causes aggressiveness. And so this is one of the ways that the tribe understood how to deal with that channeling of energy. Remember, these are not doctorates from Harvard or MIT or Oxford. These are ancient tribal rituals. These are fascinating. This absolutely fascinates me. And so that's how they would deal with it. So I've always imagined, I know this is not going to go well with certain people, but anyway, certain people in our culture. I've always imagined what would happen if any of these tribes people came to Western civilization, which I'm sure they have, came to Western civilization and asked the leaders of Western civilization, what do you do with boys around that time when there's that development issue, there's that increase of aggressiveness, what do you do? And they would say, well, we put them in a classroom and talk to them all day. And I can hear them saying, are you kidding me? You're going to see crime increase. You're going to see an increase of crime. You're going to see violence. You're going to see aggressiveness. You're going to see killings. You're going to see all this stuff, which is what gang activity is. And you notice when they start recruiting gangs, they start recruiting kids for gangs prior to that period, but it obviously covers that period, right? So this is, and I could imagine, see, this is that ancient wisdom saying, you do realize that's not the best way to handle this situation. Now, some people may come back and say, yeah, but they have sport around that time. They have this around that time. They have that around that time. Yes, they do. But I do believe that probably putting people into classrooms during that time, although it's a necessity for our society, probably isn't the best of things. And if I obviously we're not married, I'll tell you a story about that. But if I was married and I had a son, I would encourage him into vocational school, because that vocational idea is really, whether it's built on that idea, it really is part of that idea, that vocational school. I would definitely encourage them into vocational school. Reminds me, I was at a phone dealer. It was an authorized retailer. So if you went, and so I'm not going to say the phone dealer, but if you know what phone service I use, you'd know. And of course, they have the logo and the whole bit, but then it'll say authorized retailer, because the store is not owned by what they call corporate, what I would say O&O, owned and operated. So it's an authorized retailer. Otherwise, the store looks exactly the same. But they're trying to get me to buy another line. And I said, what do I need another line for? I have one. I actually have two. I don't need another line. Well, no, but this would be good, and you get a discount. And if you do this, this would be a wonderful line. And I no. And finally I said, and the person said to me, well, think of it. Of course, here's how to insult someone in two ways in one simple sentence. She said, well, you could have a line for one of your grandchildren. I looked at her. Now, I was dressed as a priest. I looked at her. I said, do you see what I do for a living? And I said, we don't have grandchildren. And then she realized what she said. So now she called me old, and she didn't recognize what I did for a living. All in one sentence. All in one sentence. Really something. So anyway, that's it's fascinating. But that's one of the things I look at. I imagine people, those tribes coming to any of the Western cultures today going, that's what you do? Are you serious? But that's, again, one of the reasons why I would strongly encourage. If I was a parent today, I would strongly encourage my sons and daughters, maybe. I don't know as much the same dynamic plays in daughters. I don't know. I have no clue. No clue. Sorry. But yeah, I would definitely encourage vocational school. We're going to be back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. Well, it's now a week before Lent. So as I said, this is a really good time to start preparing what are you going to do for Lent. And this is the time for us to resolve to make our Lent powerful, to make it a real powerful Lent. We should do that every year, but, let's make it. Now, let me tell you, my first Lent back to the church, what did I choose to do? And I obviously made it pretty powerful, but what did I choose to do? It was simple. I chose to go back to church. That was it. Because I wasn't going back to church yet. I started to come back to church when I was in the Philippines. And that was probably, from Lent, maybe about 4, 5, 6 months earlier. And I've told you the experience. If you didn't know the experience of what ultimately led me back to church, there were a few things. But if you didn't know the experience, I was a heavy drinker at that time. Heavy drinker. You know how you got these people who are really heavy gamblers, and when they show up at a casino, like the casino stops and does everything for them because they know how much money they're going to put down in the casino. Well, I should have been treated like that by the beer makers of the world, including San Miguel when I was in the Philippines and some of the others when I was here back in the States. So anyway, a kind of a interesting little story I can tell you. I don't think I was. I may. We'll just for the heck of it say I was 18. We'll say I was 18, and because back then the drinking age was 18, and I worked in we'll say the food industry, which I did, and we would go. It was a catering place. We would go place to place. Well, it was traditional for the people who were part of the industry who were of age for the bartender to give them a beer at the end. And so he asked me, what would you want to drink? And we will say I was 18 at that time, which was the legal age. Can't remember, but I'll never forget that. And he says, well, what do you want? And I asked for a Michelob. And he said, boy, you do know how to drink. I guess, because that's what I preferred drinking at that time. But in any case, if you remember the story, it was breakfast. It was a Sunday morning. It was 9 o'clock or even earlier. And I was getting, like everyone else does in a normal world, get bacon and eggs and beer. Gotta have my beer with my bacon and eggs. And it was Sunday morning. And there was no, and by the way, I didn't normally do that. When you're in the Navy, you can't drink when you're on a ship. At all, in port or out. You can drink off the ship when you're in port, but you can't drink on the ship in port or at sea, except under very rare circumstances. And those circumstances have to be approved by the Chief of Naval Operations. This is true. So there's no drinking on ships. So I was off the ship. It was Sunday morning. I had basically had a day off, and I was going to get a drink with my bacon and eggs. I was trying to get beer, but since it was Sunday morning, they weren't selling beer, or they weren't selling alcohol at all. So all the beer lockers were closed. So I couldn't get one. And of course the bars were closed and everything on base. This was at Subic Bay. So I eventually ate my breakfast and left the base so that at 9 o'clock in the morning, or roughly thereabouts, I could have a beer in the morning. And that's when I realized, maybe I got a bit of a problem here. I don't know. And I actually made a deal with God at that point that I was going to come back. And it took me a while. And actually, I went back to church before I quit drinking. I was quitting drinking. I was taking the steps to quit drinking, but I still hadn't done it yet. And it wasn't until I had a really bad hangover, I think in April, so that might have been after Easter, in Alameda, California. One of my favorite bases in the Navy, and one of the most heartbreaking things I ever see is the Alameda Naval Air Base is closed, and it was used on Mythbusters for a lot of their experiments because it's closed. And I'm like, Alameda was one of my favorite bases. So in any case, I had been sober for about a month, and I said, no, I don't have to worry about it. I can drink. Now I've been sober, I can control my drinking, which is always the excuse that happens. And the way I would drink was I would have, I would have a White Russian, and then a Black Russian, and sometimes I'd have a sombrero, or maybe I'd start with sombrero, and then I would go into beer. So maybe it's sombrero, because I know when I was in Hong Kong, I had a sombrero. It is the best sombrero I ever had. It was made with condensed milk. So in Hong Kong. So in any case, but there I was, White Russian, Black Russian, and then went down beer. So I got Bellotto, right, as I normally did. But this was been a whole month of being sober. So I recognized when I woke up the next morning that, nope, I can't do that because I'm just going to follow down the same path. But I also woke up with the worst hangover I have ever had. Actually, the second worst hangover I have ever had. The worst hangover I ever had is when I had a really bad hangover and the ship went out to sea. And they always tell you never have a hangover when you're out to sea. And we hit 16-foot swells, and you could have killed me, and I would have not cared. It was horrendous. I'll never forget that. But that still didn't get me to quit drinking. So it was actually finally after this really bad hangover in San Francisco. We were in San Francisco. This was back in the 70s. It was a wonderful time to be in the Navy, and we were up in Frisco, and we went to the Keystone Corner Jazz Club that night, and just what an experience. It was wonderful. Or one of the nights I was there. It was just absolutely wonderful, the Keystone Corner, which was this well-known jazz club. And heard Jackie McLean. It was just wonderful. But anyway, that was San Francisco. So that's and that whole story of quitting drinking, taking about 6 months or whatever it took to quit drinking, eventually I did. And I've been sober now since, since 1980. So, but I went to church, back to church before I formally ended drinking. It was probably during the period when I was not drinking much. I wasn't drinking really, but it wasn't the period before I finally realized you can't. You just can't. Okay, I don't do Alcoholics Anonymous. I just don't drink. Now, I will drink under very controlled circumstances, but I'm very limited what I drink. I've told you that story. If I'm not driving, I will have a beer and then go to non-alcoholic beer. I was driving anyway, but I was at a bar and restaurant tonight as I record this with a friend of mine, and I was waiting for him, and so I was sitting at the bar waiting for him to come in. This was up in Ayer, Massachusetts at Lucia's Tavola. What a great place. Tell you that right now. Lucia's Tavola, right in downtown Ayer, Ayer, Massachusetts. If you're looking up AIR for a town in Massachusetts, you won't find one. Ayer, Ayer. It's right next to Devon's. Massachusetts, where Fort Devens is. So, in any case, there was Lucia's Tavola. So I came in, sat at the bar, and what did I ask for? Heineken 00, because it's non-alcoholic beer. And it looks like a regular beer, but it's Heineken 00. So that's what do you have any Heineken 00? Yes, we do. Great. I'll have some Heineken 00. And then I had a Diet Coke, and then my friend arrived. We went to but you see that. So my first act of really taking my Lent seriously, that whole story to tell you all that, was to go back to church. So this is the time to start going back to church. And it was going back to church, which I will talk about later as we get closer to Lent, that it was that first Sunday in Lent where the priest preached about not giving up candy for Lent. And I'm like, this is the guy I want to listen to. And I preach that every year. But that was it. So it's a great time. This is the time to really make our Lent count. It really is, because we should say that every year. Always say, let's make our Lent count this year. And, not to just say, well, this is the time that I just do this and that's what I do. But this is the time. And as I said earlier, one of the things to look at, what do you find the most distracting thing that's taking up too much of your time? And because of that, you're taking too much of your time up. And because of that, you're not being able to pray to the level you want to, or you're not being able to work to the level you want to, especially, I'm a writer. My schedule changed, so I've been having trouble finding a time to write. And that's been really painful for me. That was one of the great things. I was over in Marketplace, was it Thorndike Marketplace in Northampton, Massachusetts, bookstore there. And that always inspires me. That's one of the reasons why I go. And it inspired me. So I got to get back to writing. So I get into that. And one of the things I'm going to look at is not watching YouTube, as I talked about on Monday. At least not as much as I have. We're going to talk more on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Going back to receive your high school diploma can make a huge difference in your life. Not just for you, but for your loved ones and your community as well. Across the country, thousands of free adult education centers are ready to help with teachers who will guide you every step of the way. Find free and supportive adult education centers near you at finishyourdiploma.org. Brought to you by the Dollar General Literacy Foundation and the Ad Council and the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at CatholicAudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and so today is also the memorial of Our Lady of Lourdes. This is the great story. You probably know the movie Song of Bernadette. If you don't, you may want to check that out today. But this is the story of Our Lady of Lourdes and Bernadette seeing Mary at Lourdes, which ultimately became this Lourdes water. Sometimes you meet someone, they went to Lourdes and they brought the water back, and this water of healing. And so that's something to check out. Now, if you go to Lourdes, it doesn't mean you're going to be healed, but there are people who have been healed at Lourdes. And so do understand that. But it's a great place of devotion to draw closer to Christ, which is what all these devotions are all about. So that's the memorial of today, Our Lady of Lourdes. And it is the source of how we end up venerating Saint Bernadette of France. In the meantime, we're going to talk tomorrow. We're going to talk more about Solomon, and we're going to see This guy who was this great source of wisdom, who had this great relationship with God, and then all of a sudden he got distracted, which is also a great thing for us to look at this time when we will be less than a full week tomorrow, less than a full week before when Lent starts. So we'll talk to you again tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, to comment, and we will see you tomorrow. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.